The 80s was where fantasy cinema really came alive, thanks mostly to George Lucas and Steven Spielberg. The dawn of Jim Henson's Creature Shop and George Lucas's Industrial Light and Magic, the budgets afforded fantasy through Lucas and Spielberg's string of genre successes, and the kind of pseudo-cronyism that gets their friends like John Milius, Conan's auteur, a job, are the only reason a movie like this can exist. Milius was talented but odd. He's the basis for Walter Sobchak in The Big Lebowski, a strange hybrid of the conservative temperament of a veteran with the sentiment of a Hollywood screenwriter. And honest, the Coen...
You do not! Also, dude, Chinaman is not the preferred nomenclature. Asian American, please.
Walter, this isn't a guy who built the railroads here. This is a guy...
Oh, 1,100 men went in the war. 316 men come out. The Sharks took the rest June the 29th, 1945. Anyway, we delivered the bomb.
And adapted Hearts of Darkness into Apocalypse Now. Thanks to Milius's unique sensibilities, Conan is less a children's fantasy and more the unholy offspring of a Sergio Leone western, a Kurosawa Ronin film, and a Wagnerian opera, and one of the few 80s fantasy films I'd considered true cinema. It does magic, ghosts, monsters, but it never feels like a movie with sorcerers, giant snakes, and magic swords, because Milius presents all of that as if adapting actual past events of an ancient character, and by measuring the character's reactions as surprised but not shocked by the supernatural things they encounter. The giant snake is exactly as off-putting to Conan as the cult is. By opening with child Conan learning of Crom, god of steel, and then having Thulsa Doom and his serpent cult arrive and annihilate Conan's people and enslave him, the story arrests Conan and the audience in a child's worldview, one where magic and monsters are real, but strange adults are worse. In a way, the craziest, highest fantasy things in Conan's world are love, sex, and family. In other words, adulthood. This also recapitulates our experience of the world if we are religious people or come from a religious family, wherein we are told magical things as a child and continue to believe them into adulthood. The only difference is Conan gets to see this come true later in life. And the only problem with the origin as delivered is that it's the exact inversion of what we know to have happened in the past. And it's revealing that the changes were probably done merely to align with a Protestant Christian realism, an indoctrination into the Western Protestant American worldview, and the desire of the artists to recapitulate the myths they were raised with and to not contradict them. This mindset is what fed the satanic panic of the 1980s, something Conan mimics with its depiction of Doom's serpent cult as a 60s satanic Manson family and the princess as a brainwashed Patty Hearst analog. Milius is not an intentional propagandist. He's simply adapting a story to his own cultural lens. But that lens is revealing that the propagating of Christian realism directly inverts archaic history as we found it. Just beneath every monotheistic patriarchal empire's ruins, we find a layer of relatively peaceful, egalitarian, dragon goddess cults across the world, and evidence of their being eradicated by a patriarchal storm, sun, and sky god, and mountain gods of steel and metallurgy. It's almost as if lighter-skinned northern pastoral monotheists, not serpent-worshipping androgynous magicians of color, were the invasive cult of violent extremists. It's almost like the bad guys won, and inverted history to make themselves the heroes, and then portrayed an idea of linear progress ending at themselves as a form of manifest destiny, and a signifier of themselves as progressive, and their enemy as the savage past. This inversion problem is inherent to a lot of fantasy, from the most frivolous fantasy comic books to the height of literature, to games we play to escape our own identity. Dungeons & Dragons has a race problem. The underlying nature of its reality accepts racist premises, and encodes them as literal concrete species with true stereotypical traits. Dark skin is a sign of evil, blondness is good, dwarves are short and hairy, live in mountains and mine and hoard gems for their god. Its attempt to correct this, 4th edition, was, well, just the kind of reformation one can expect from people who don't know what they did wrong. It took away all the advantages and disadvantages, yet left the races there, despite them serving no real mechanical purpose to the game anymore. 5th edition corrects this by focusing on story and so relinquishing a lot of the need for mechanical differences between the races, transforming them into performance boundaries, while restoring differences of trait like size, which is the most varied physical trait of fantasy species anyway and certainly must affect their abilities. Still, if a drow or dark elf is a paladin, the archetype of the goody two-shoes white knight. They are rebelling against their nature. Exceptions do not break, but reinforce the racialized infrastructure. Some will tell you racism is not a behavior, but a system. This is itself propaganda that serves only to make it impossible to be racist if one is black, whitewashing, so to speak, racism against Latinos, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism on the part of the African American community. Everyone can be racist, and racism is racial hatred, and racial hatred instantly makes you part of the actual system, the very idea of race. If you accept the premise of race, you support a system that ends in racism, regardless of your race, which is imaginary. D&D inherited a premise it doesn't know how to root out of its fiction system, because it didn't invent the fantasy races. The races come from Tolkien, who used European folklore to create a mythic retelling of the world wars, and aped his Protestant realism in its creation myth. He, like 5th edition D&D, tried to eliminate the anti-Semitism and racism from the sources, but instead inherited and accidentally transmitted views of national races, chosen people, dark skin as evil, and a mixed nature villain from his Protestant realism, the Western view of Hitler, disparate European folklore, and Wagner's Ring Cycle. The Ring Cycle was an opera adapting Norse mythology, whose anti-Semitic rendition of its Lord of the Dwarves had been forged in the fires of 19th century Deutschland's anti-Semitic sentiment and an already growing Scandinavian fetish. Anthropologically and etymologically, all the creatures of modern fantasy, elves, night elves, drow, dwarves, halflings, hobbits, gnomes, orcs, goblins, giants, etc., all begin as either a kind of fey folk or as another word for troll. A brownie or a gremlin, essentially, helping or hurting the common folk. Fae are a quintessential middle race, magical or mixed nature beings neither heavenly nor demonic that have rare but decisive interactions with humans. Other mythological races of this rank and purpose include the Jinn of Islam, Genii Loci, and Noumena, or spirits of a place from Roman belief, saints and witches, Greek daemons and nymphs, fates, household gods, pixies, sprites, and demigods. Fae and fate are cognate, and a daemon is literally a dispenser, e.g. of fates or lots. All serve the same purpose, a personification of luck, good or bad, whereby some supernatural entity is why you, a thing, or a place is having a particularly bad or good run of it, that by naming we may invoke to suit our ends. Norse Fae came with the standard light-dark dichotomy, elves and night elves. Elf comes from elb, which means white, and so a dark night or black elf was a night white or a dark white, which is kind of silly. It's possible the archaic Norse or the Proto-Indo-Europeans who created the earlier versions of these stories did not have any real experience with actual black people and simply invented night and day species of Fae. The last glacial maximum would have made the sun the savior of humanity and riser of the oceans, causing great floods and the vanishing of land bridges and island cultures. It would be natural for some northerners and mountain folk to never have the courage to go back down into the plains for long, thinking it would only flood again. For them, the sun and its light continued to save them from deadly winters, and its disappearance at the winter solstice would have meant a mass die-off every year. It's only natural they associate the sun's return with salvation and goodness, and the night as wicked and deadly, and the sky as a setting for war or as a harsh father in a crown of gold. The frost giants also, with their imposing size and imperviousness to ice, were likely based on Nordic humans' interactions with their environment. But of course, the Vikings were the frost giants, really. Let me explain. Once, the original peoples who would be the Vikings were an equalitarian, almost utopian alliance. Anthropological evidence points to women being on their boats, working, worshipping, and fighting alongside them, and a hyper-groomed male subculture with complex braiding, a sign of feminine freedom to choose sexual partners. Before this, the region's cultures were a diverse group of overlapping tribal cultures. Yet by the close of their Bronze Age, the Vikings were marauding pirates led by kings, worshipping the same skyfather of war, metallurgy, and storms as their neighbors, the Mycenaean and Rigvedic peoples. After their encounter with the hypothetical Proto-Indo-Europeans, a pastoral culture that seemed to spread down from the Caucasus and Taurus Mountains and invade every indigenous culture along the Mediterranean shores, leaving behind bits of language and practice. Tales of abominable snowman are common to all mountainous regions. If we trace back the etymology and earliest stories of all of them, we come to similar, if not common, origins. Frost giants, yeti, Bigfoot, werewolves all seem to describe the same type of man, large mountain men who wore furs and ate meat to survive the colder climes, perhaps even the meat of people, as their Native American counterpart, the Wendigo, did. Centaur, which means not horseman but cow killer, originates from the first men on horseback who raided the villages, killed cows, and stole women. Indications are that the plains people subsisted on vegetarian diets consisting of mostly beans and deified the cow and perhaps even followed herds to sustenance and watering holes. Magic mushrooms grow nocturnally from the dung of horned animals beneath evergreens and grant poetic thought patterns, better night vision, and more communal thinking. And so plains people were more likely to worship cows and deer, the earth, the stars, and the moon. The cow's milk could dilute or end the visions as well as keep the tribe alive when there wasn't other food. To an archaic plains person, any meat eater would look like a cannibal, and the word kentar would be like the words cannibal and motherfucker put together. Only the mother was God, and these fur-covered giants with horse legs and lightning in their hands slaughtered and ate her. How terrifying they must have been. Larger and stronger from a carnivore diet, yet also dumber, mad from neurological diseases, and mutated from the incest demanded by their isolation in hills, mountains, and box canyons. Living in the highlands would demand the technology of furs and eating meat. We see from any historical account of men stranded in snowy mountain regions that we quickly descend into cannibalism. The slaughter of men and mountain animals like goats would require the development of sacrificial steel like battle axes and swords, rather than the double axes for cutting wood we find in the goddess cultures. The harsh environs of the snow and low sunlight would cause a worship of the sun and paler skin. The mountain living combined with sun worship would lead to hierarchical thinking, with a king on top, the stream of his waste contaminating those who lived below him, trickling down, if you will, and the sun the only authority higher than him. This combination would devolve rather quickly into patriarchal rule, no matter what you started with. Keeping goats rather than having to look for them would naturally follow, necessitating the development of fences and borders. Fences built to keep out wolves and leopards eventually keep out neighboring shepherds and keep in sheep, but also your daughters. Selling animals becomes selling children in exchange for goods. Stealing sheep because your neighbor will not shear becomes stealing those children. In Outliers, Malcolm Gladwell cited a university experiment that showed that people descended from mountain-based cultures like Scotland tended to be honorific and to hold grudges for longer than anyone else. It was the Scottish descendants in the hills of Kentucky that produced the infamous Hatfields and McCoys. Constant border skirmishes, obsession with fences and hierarchies, the herding and selling of life, the trapping and control of feminine sexuality as a means of breeding both sheep and people, boys for heirs and soldiers, girls for sex trafficking and more breeding. The Proto-Indo-Europeans are often called the Kurgans for their habit of mound burials of individuals rather than mass pit graves. The burial mound is merely a recapitulation of the mountain for the traveling dead, a return home, if you will. The pyramid is but a burial mound that seeks to outdo the mountain, demonstrating not only that the pharaoh is a better god, but that this is how mountains get built, by slavery. To a Kurgan, meanwhile, how demonic and ugly the shorter, night-dwelling plains people, darker skinned from living in sunlight, would appear. Little trolls who dwell in the underworld at the base of the mountain, inhuman enough to be prey, but human enough to mate with. And after a cataclysm like a flood or plague, vulnerable to a raid. And when you did raid, you'd find treasures beyond your reckoning from a culture with a much more vibrant imagination than yours, building great halls and temples and cities dedicated to labyrinthine serpents that guard the mysteries of life, sex, birth, and death. Those labyrinths, like the complex wombs of the duck, likely evolving to hide their most important mysteries from Kurgan raiders. An interesting thing happens when a patriarchal culture conquers a matriarchy, a female-ruled culture, or a female-led culture, a Gylany, as Riane Eisler called it in her seminal work, The Chalice and the Blade. See, if a patriarchy conquers a patriarchy, the men slaughter the male leaders and with them erase the entire conquered culture. The women become concubines and slaves, their children inherit no power, and the primary knowledge of the people is lost in a generation. If a patriarchy conquers a Gylany or matriarchy, the men, who were not particularly influential, are slaughtered and the women taken as wives, concubines, and slaves because a patriarchy does not understand that women can be leaders at all. So the leaders of one culture take on the leaders of the other. Their children, born of the largest, strongest, and most ambitious men of a patriarchy, and the most intelligent, cultured, and influential women of a Gylany, are then taught culture, religion, politics, literature, and strategy by their mothers at home, as their fathers leave for most of the year to fight endless wars. When they come of age, the sons are sent off to learn warfare, perhaps not as the favored son, but one more likely to excel on the battlefield, one who rises through the ranks quicker than his father's inbred natural heirs. These sons would have no claim to their father's thrones, but literal queens turned housemaids would never let that stop them. They'll poison your entire family while you're gone, leaving their child as the only heir. They'll wait for you to arrive home and slit your throat in the night. Now their boy is king. Inside a generation, we have powerful hybrid cultures, lunisolar calendars, divine couples or twins, dominant both culturally and militaristically. In other words, ancient empires. In many ways, the entire Eastern Hemisphere may be descended from people who slaughtered, appropriated, and rapaciously hybridized with everyone else, effectively eradicating them through genocide and forced interbreeding, but also annihilating themselves via the same process, leaving behind only Creole cultures of the imperial and slave ethnicities combined. If we delve into the story traditions of ancient Greece, we find echoes of a culture that, while ostensibly patriarchal, was largely made up of women and their children, and absent fathers too busy adventuring abroad and dying to possibly be governing. No, it is the women who governed Greece, the men who ruled the battlefield. If we look at Hellenic female characters as Circe and Medea and Medusa, essentially the same word, by the way, queen, the goddesses Demeter, Athena, Hestia, Hera, Hecate. The female archetype of ancient Mycenae and Greece is not a shy, cowering flower. They are all, top to bottom, Machiavellian, brutal, beautiful, and stoic. When we reread these portrayals, it would perhaps do us well to do so through the lens not of willing partners, but spoils of conquest, gifts, and treaties personified, or at very least property sold by fathers like a goat after their mothers or great-grandmothers were spoils of conquest. And yet still descended from queens. Many named queen or priestess or magistrate. Their titles, things like Pythia, speaker for the deep. The goddesses likely to turn you into food for your own dogs if you kill a deer in their forest. Do not fuck with these women. The grand irony of history is that invading patriarchal forces were often made up of the outcast and exiled males of the Gylony, sent to the mountains or forests to die, who form a sort of prison culture out there. The males in the wild at the edges of the feminine-governed cities interact more with these outcast men than with the women, probably developing sympathy for them, or at least being manipulated by psychopaths in their midst through their ignorance as uneducated warriors. After gaining enough sympathy, mostly from dying so much, they begin to win over the border guards. The women begin to look like the interlopers, these men trying to return home and restore a former glory. A glory invented by inverting the history of the city itself as being created by them. The unspoken part being they mean to get back in, to rape and murder, and end civilization. This is a recurring pattern throughout history, a social ship of Theseus, where the criminal exiled and the exiling utopia feel the homeland to be theirs and the others to be interlopers. By outgrowing execution but never inventing rehabilitation and not educating the male populace, we create our own downfalls. We didn't just exile criminals and madmen, but children and babies as well. As a form of abortion, or to get rid of ones thought to be changelings, or prophesied to kill the king, that sort of thing we see pop up as a motif in popular literature. Many of the invasive cultures are then begun by rejected sons, the stones that the builder refused that become the keystones of the new building. There is indication that David, progenitor of the Hebrews, and Moses were both sacrifices that survived. Oedipus and Snow White, likewise, escaped the culling hand of the sacrifice and returned to annihilate their sacrificing parent, in a cycle portrayed as predictable and yet inescapable. Eventually, even the Hellenes would be conquered by Rome, their gods and culture more popular by leagues than the Roman, so that Rome renamed all their gods and appropriated them. Later, they would use the same technique when Christians became a problem. Suicidal extremists would attack Rome to provoke a disproportionate reaction and gain sympathetic recruitment from amidst the common people. They called themselves witnesses, or martyrs in the Latin. With every suicide attack, Nero's response became more vicious and monstrous, revealing Rome to be less civilized than it had appeared, and in need, perhaps, of saving. On a long enough timeline, no matter how just the large state or corrupt the small group, if a big guy kills enough of a little guy, the big guys look like villains, and the little guys like underdogs. Muslim extremist groups like Daesh or Al-Qaeda never attack where Muslims are persecuted. Look, right now, at how silent they are in response to Israel's campaign in Gaza. They attack where Muslims are tolerated and equal, to drum up Islamophobia and persecution in the area, which helps win over new recruits and radicalize moderates. And it can be argued, retaliation proves their point. The proportionate reaction to a people that cannot defeat you, attacking and mostly killing themselves, is not to retaliate at all, but to solve the problem that's causing the strife. Negotiating with terrorists is a loser's game. One shouldn't give in to the demands of suicidal killers and sociopaths, sure. But if they hide their rockets under a school, don't blow up the school. Build a new school and rescue the children. Remove the ability of the enemy to recruit by proving yourself the opposite of their sales pitch again and again without end. Turn the other cheek. Let them hit you in front of everyone as you continue to respond with kindness until they stop or everyone knows they're the villain. That's what they're doing, and it works every time. It's math in the end. If I show up as a member of a vastly inferior force, kill one or two people, including myself, then I have already disproportionately killed my own side. I delivered my own payback. Roman forces are in the 100,000s, Christian forces in the hundreds, so one martyr is equal to 100 Roman citizens. If Rome retaliates at all, it is instant overkill. There can be no proportionate response between a state and a suicide cult or terrorist organization or a revolutionary force, other than infrastructure and kindness toward the people that cult claims to be fighting for, but shows a propensity at sacrificing. Healing the other side halts the need for the gang, the terror organization, the cult, or the riot, and halts recruitment. Eventually, Rome's only move was to make Christianity the official religion, ending the war with the first corporate buyout of a competitor. By becoming the church, Rome gained control over the canon of its mythos and got to remake Christianity in Rome's image, specifically the image of its cult to Sol Invictus, or undefeated sun, a form of Mithras worshipped by Constantine. When he saw a cross in the sun, it wasn't a conversion to Christianity, but a realization that the answer was syncretism, the combination of two or more gods' identities, and thus their theologies, into a single entity. He realized how the Christian God was Sol Invictus, had always been, and thus would rise the Holy Roman Empire. All of this accomplished by merely retelling the Christian story in a Roman fashion, a universal, world-conquering way that rewrote the mythologies they encountered into parts of their own, the way Disney buys IPs that grant them entry into the public's consciousness.